Welcome class to Unit 4B. As I said before, Unit 4 is the most vital unit from now until the end of the year. And so we just did 4A, which was talking about fiscal policy, injections and leakages, introducing you to aggregate supply and aggregate demand. This smaller, only 4 lesson unit is about the money supply and creating money and interest rates. And so please take your time to focus on this unit as it is going to be definitely covered in university courses as well as it's helpful in understanding what you're reading in the news. And today we're not starting at the beginning of the chapter, but we're actually kind of diving right into one of the more difficult pieces as part of this unit. That's creating money and how do banks create money in a kind of narrow focused lens. So today we want to look at how to evaluate the impact of the banking system on money supply. We want to be able to calculate how impact of deposits and withdrawals in a single and in a multi-bank system. There are two different systems. Understanding how the banking system works to influence the money supply and the economy. And hopefully you're going to see yourself working through creating money and being able to see success in doing that, and obviously completion of the review and the homework. And so let's dive straight into creating money. So we're going to look at how banks actually create quote unquote money. And so to begin, we're not talking necessarily about printing money. We're not talking about just like you're hearing in the news these days, banks are just printing more bills, and that's going to cause a certain amount of inflation, or it could cause hyperinflation, as you may have seen in other courses. It's happened in Germany, it's happened in Zimbabwe, several places where hyperinflation has happened because central banking systems have created money just by printing money. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about creating money for spending but not printing more bills per se. And so our first assumption here right now is to assume there's only one banking system. And of course this is not true, but we're going to try to go this route because I think this route's the harder one. And so hopefully by understanding this first, you will get the multi-bank system a little bit easier. But assume there's only one banking system and there's one bank. And so if I am the one bank, I control all of the money in the system. I see it, I use it, I can loan it, I can do whatever I want with it because there's only one system, and I know all the money is ends up being deposited in my bank. And so it's important to understand what the bank has and what it means to the bank. And so if you've taken an accounting class, you'll know what assets are. Now, assets are something of value that one owns. While liabilities are something of value that is owed. And so banks are the same. Banks have assets and banks have liabilities. And so you're going to see banks operate, and you're going to see them use money in a way that shows an asset level and a liability level. And so if you look at your own bank accounts, right? And so if you put money in the bank, that money is actually a liability for the bank, right? Because that's not their money, that's your money. And so the bank has a liability in your deposit, like whatever you have, $1,000, $5,000 in the bank. That bank has to give that back to you. That's why it's a liability. So they're borrowing it from you basically. But you've also put cash in their vault, and so they can use that cash as an asset to do with as they please. So they're using that to earn more money in other ways, and we're going to explore that in a minute. And so to look at this very simplified balance sheet, it's assets equals liabilities. Um, we don't have capital here, and so that's a whole different story. But if we just look very, very simply, if you put a deposit in the bank of $10,000, that's a liability for the bank. And the bank is going to have cash as an asset to do what they want with, right? And so here's the scenario. You put $10,000 into the bank. Can the bank just use that money on something else, buy something else, invest in something else, or loan it out to someone else? No, right? Because what if you want that money? So there's something that's called the reserve ratio that exists for all these banks. And see, these banks hold a certain percentage of money for every dollar that's deposited, right? So if you deposit $10,000, the bank knows that it has to keep on hand X amount of dollars, or a certain percent of dollars for you, because you may come back the next day and want a little bit of that money, right? But they know that you're not going to likely want all of the money, because that's why you put it in the bank, because you want to save it there, or just have it there to hold. And so you're not going to want it all, or else you wouldn't have put it in the bank. And so they've calculated a certain amount of money that they need to hold for every dollar of deposit that exists in the bank. And so, for example, if the reserve ratio that they want is 10%, and you've deposited $10,000, that bank is going to hold $1,000 on reserve for you for when you want to withdraw it. And so this is just good business, right? So no bank wants to loan out more than they can afford to, because someone may come back the next day and demand their money, and if the bank can't produce that money, that's a problem for the bank, right? People are going to stop wanting to bank there, and so in reality, you might ask, oh, so what's the reserve ratio for Canada? Canadian banks don't really have a reserve ratio. Most first world nations or high economy nations don't have reserve ratios because their banking system is very sophisticated, and each one of these banks understands the need to hold on to reserves, and so there's no really mandated number that they have to hold because they're smart enough to do it on their own to hold a certain amount of reserve for each depositor. The reserve ratio might be more common in other countries where the banking system isn't as reliable, or isn't that old, or it's very new, and so the central banks of those countries, dictate, you need to have this much money for your clients because they don't trust the banks as much, and the clients want to be able to trust and put their money in it. And so the reserve ratio, while not an actual number for all nations, is still a number that each bank is going to want to hold or choose internally if there's no central banking system that makes you hold, for example, a 10% reserve, right? And so, but conceptually, you have to understand that each bank is going to hold some of the money on hand in cash for its customers to get back. And so, in this scenario, we have a $10,000 deposit, a $1,000 reserve that has to be there in the bank at all times for the people to get their money. And so now exists a $9,000 piece of money left over. And so the question is going to be, what does the bank do with that money? And so the bank's going to try to earn more money from that $9,000. And so I want to remind you, our first assumption right now is that this is a one bank system, and there is only one bank, and all the money in the world, or whatever this nation is, ends up back in this bank, assuming people are using a banking system, right? And so, in theory, the bank can use $9,000 for loans, okay? But notice I've written down to fund loans. And so in this scenario, most of you are going to say, okay, they'll use $9,000 to loan. But in reality, that $9,000 is not the actual loan, okay? That $9,000 is going to turn into something to fund loans. So let's look at this. We'll look at this current scenario. This is the scenario from before. Deposits are $10,000. There's a $1,000 reserve, and this bank now has $9,000. And so lots of people say $9,000 becomes a loan, where in fact, this $9,000 becomes something different. And so it becomes an actual reserve for a loan. Okay, and so that might be confusing. Let's just repeat that a little bit. So the bank has $9,000, right? This $9,000 does not become a loan. This $9,000 actually becomes a reserve for a loan, right? Because the rule is the bank has to hold 10% of the actual deposit in cash. And so the bank can say, I'm going to loan you $90,000, anyone, right? I'm going to make a loan of $90,000. And so they're going to say, here's $90,000 to someone, and that person is going to deposit it in their bank account, or they're going to use it to buy a fancy car. And so that money is $90,000. And so why can they do this? They can do this because they have $9,000 in cash, right? They only have to be holding the actual reserve amount in cash. And so if they have that $9,000 in cash, they can say, we have the cash for a $90,000 loan. And so again, I know it's confusing, but why can they do this? They can do this because they know that money is going to come back into their banking system, right? So They loan $90,000 because if you loan $90,000 to someone, it's most likely going to be to buy something, right? No bank, or very few scenarios where you can say, I need a loan from a bank, and they put all this money in a briefcase and hand it to you. They're not giving you cash, right? If you need a loan to buy a $90,000 car, all the financing is done. There's no actual cash that changes hands physically. A bank calls a different bank or whatnot, and the money is just transferred. And so this $9,000 is just the reserve for this new loan, because that new loan is just going to end up in my bank anyway, because there's only one bank, right? So if I went to the car dealership, so maybe you wanted to go buy a Porsche, right? So you go to the Porsche dealership and you say, I want to buy this Porsche, and you call your bank, I need a $90,000 loan to buy this Porsche. And so they say, yes, here's a $90,000 loan. And then you talk to your Porsche dealership and you say, Porsche dealership, give me that car. I got my loan. And so the Porsche dealership calls their bank, which is the same bank. And they say, is the money transferred from my account or from their account to my account? And so the bank will just say, yes. They type in a few numbers. $90,000 now goes away from the person buying the car to Porsche dealership. And now the person who bought the Porsche owes the bank money now. And the Porsche dealership's account deposit went up to $90,000. But that's fine because the bank still has a $9,000 reserve, right? And this only works because there's one bank, and I know at the bank all the money I've loaned out is going to end up coming back to me in the end anyway. So I know there's probably going to be some questions on this, so please send me messages, so hopefully I can clarify it. But so that's the much harder to conceptualize one. And so the reason why I want to show you this one first is it's harder, as well as it is an all-encompassing kind of look at what the next scenario is going to be. And so we make some key points, right? We want to look at the fact that the loan becomes a deposit. We want to look at the fact that electronic transfer of data makes this possible. Without electronic transfer, these things become much more cumbersome and clunky. With electronic data and computer systems and technology, these are just keystrokes moving money. It's seamless, it's easy, there's no physical need for actual cash. And that's happening more and more these days. How often do people actually use cash, right? You're young people, so you might be using cash more than myself, but I use a credit card for almost everything. I use my bank card for almost everything. Very, very infrequently, I'll use cash. I buy a coffee, I use a card, right? So physical money is much less needed these days. Another key point is money is always coming back into this one bank system. And so that's why I know I can do these transactions. So that means the reserves are always replenished, right? Anyone who takes money out is probably going to spend that money, and that money is going to come back into the bank, right? So that's the key for this one bank system, is that the money is returning all the time. Two assumptions right here that we're having to make sure that the impact is as much as it is one, each bank will lend as much as possible, and two, every person uses all of the loan. So let's keep those in mind. Each bank lends as much as possible. Each person uses all of the loan. And so I'm going to go back one slide, and we're going to look at what does that actually mean and why is it important. Right, so if we're back at this slide, we see the bank is allowed to loan $90,000 because they have this $9,000 reserve, right? The bank doesn't have to loan the entire amount. The bank could loan $80,000, right? Someone might only ask for an $80,000 loan, right? And so if the bank doesn't loan as much as they can, there's going to be less money in circulation. Two, the person is going to use the entirety of the loan, right? They might not use all of this $90,000. They might only use $87,000 or whatnot, right? So if that happens, then the impact of this loan, this creating money system, is going to be less. So be very clear with the assumptions. Each bank lends as much as possible. Each person uses all of said loan. And so now we're going to get to the easier of the two systems to look at, I hope. the multi-bank system, which we have here in Canada, which the states have. We have a chartered bank system, and so they have lots of branches, right? So we have chartered banks with lots of branch banking all over the country. And so if we use the same scenario, deposit of $10,000 and a reserve ratio of 10%, we have bank number one. So the same situation happens, $10,000 deposit, $1,000 reserve, and then there's a $9,000 cash. And so your first assumption from previous was that you would take that $9,000 and loan it out to others, right? And so now in the multi-bank system, that's what actually will happen. And so this cash, this $9,000, could become a loan, right? And so you might loan out someone $9,000 to buy something, and so that loan becomes a deposit somewhere, right? Because you bought something at a company, and that company is going to put that money into their bank account, right? And so that bank account grows by $9,000. That other bank, bank number two, has to reserve $900 now, 10% again, it's still the same. And so then now they have $8,000 extra, right? $8,100 extra. And so that $8,100 extra can also become a loan, right? And so that's loaned to someone else, some random person. That person takes $8,100 and they spend it somewhere, and it becomes a deposit in another bank. Okay, and so again, if that bank has a deposit of $8,100, they have to reserve $810, and then it happens all over again, right? So if we look at this, we see a scenario where a $10,000 deposit initially, right here, turns into a $9,000 loan, which becomes another deposit, turns into an $8,100 loan, which becomes another deposit. And then you see that $7,290, if we had more space in the slide, would become another deposit. And so if you look at the scenario, someone deposited $10,000, and in this process, we have $10,000 plus $9,000 plus $8,100. And just in a few steps, $27,100 have been deposited already, when in reality, only 10,000 real dollars was actually deposited into a bank. And so whoever that person was who deposited that initial $10,000 has just created money, or the banks have created money because of that original deposit. So $17,100 was created because in this time frame, $27,100 was in deposits, $10,000 was the original, so the difference was $17,100 in created, fabricated money that did not exist previously, now exists, right? This spending, none of the spending can happen without this $10,000 deposit. And because this $10,000 was deposited, all this new spending can happen. And this was only in 3 steps. That number is going to happen: deposit, another loan, deposit, another loan, deposit, another loan, so on and so forth. So the question now becomes is, what's going to happen, right? So this happens after 3 steps, and so what will happen if this goes on forever, right? Ultimately, gets down to $5 of reserve or loan, deposit, reserve, loan, deposit, etc., etc., etc. And so we need to look at something called the deposit multiplier. And last unit, you just looked at the money multiplier, or the multiplier, the regular multiplier. It works in exactly the same way, right? In the injections for fiscal policy, an injection happens, and then someone spends money, and then someone else can spend money, and then someone else can spend money. The same thing, right? If I get a deposit, that could be a loan for someone else, which is also spending, and that's another loan for someone else, which also becomes spending. And so how do we calculate this? The deposit multiplier is going to impact our deposits. And so the deposit multiplier is actually 1 divided by the reserve ratio. Okay, so this right here is the money multiplier. And so our total deposits equals 1 divided by reserve ratio. The reserve ratio here is 10% times the original deposit. And so in our scenario, we have 1 divided by 0.1, which is 10%, and our original deposit was $10,000. And so then we get $100,000. And so how much money was actually created? because we had an original deposit of $10,000, which was actual cash. So that was not created. So the total amount, $100,000, minus the original, is our $90,000. And so where did you see that $90,000 number from before? Right, that $90,000 number is the same as the one bank system, which is why I did both of them. So if we go back, and I'll take us back to that last slide, the one bank system does this entire process in one step. Okay, so let's go back. All right, so here we're in the one bank system again, right? So $10,000 deposit, reserve $1,000, cash $9,000. That $9,000 becomes a reserve for a $90,000 loan. And this $90,000 loan is the created money, right? $90,000 was created, $10,000 was the original. So total deposits, this $10,000 plus this $90,000, that's $100,000 of total deposits. And this $90,000 is the created money. And now we're back. That's exactly the same as the multi-bank system. $100,000 total deposits, $90,000 in created money, right? So the one bank system creates the same amount of money as the multi-bank system, but the multi-bank system takes much longer, and the one bank system will take one step. So let's dissect these assumptions that we had before. Remember, we talked about banks don't lend the full amount. If they do, full impact, but if they don't, the impact will be smaller. There'll be less reserves. There's going to be less loans, less impact. 2, cash drains. The next one was people use all of the loan, right? But that's not always true, right? People will save money. People will import goods, right? If people use some of this money to import, then that money leaves our system, and that no longer is going to be circulating money in our system, and that will reduce the impact. And so that's the entire lesson for creating money. And so relatively short lesson in terms of how many slides it was, but content-wise, it's important to understand how the banking system works to create money. And of course, the banks do a lot more than this, but this is one way that they can impact spending in our economy, right? If they are loaning out more money, if they are pushing more money into circulation, into the economy, that's the same thing as an injection, right? That we talked about in fiscal policy. They're just circulating more money is flowing, economy is growing. The same way they can take money out of the economy, loan less money, someone withdraws a deposit, and there'll be less money circulating, right? So these are ways that the bank can create money. So again, if you have any questions on this lesson, please send me an SB message, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. And please do the homework and to review what we learned today. Thank you.